It's a joy to be with all of you who are so dedicated to this cause of life. And indeed, my mission is preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope. And many people wonder, what leads a relatively young person to be so committed to this issue? And when I think about what it is that led me to this mission, several things come to mind. One of them was certainly my relationship with my grandfather. I had a very warm relationship with my Polish Jewish grandfather who came to Canada before the war. And for several years, he lived with my family in our home from the time he was 89 until his death at age 96. And he died naturally, thank God, in 2015, before euthanasia was legal. And having him in my life and in our home made a huge impression on me. He challenged me and he provoked me, and he was the one who dared me to kind of face up to the history of the Holocaust and motivated me to go on that trip that was mentioned to Germany and Poland, where, as we heard about earlier in the day, these topics of dehumanization confronted me in a way that was etched upon my conscience and really engraved upon my heart. So when the government started talking about legalizing euthanasia, it did so ostensibly for those whose deaths were reasonably foreseeable. And having my grandfather in my life in his late 80s and early 90s, I immediately had the sense that this meant people like him and families like mine. And also seeing him in certain moments of weakness and maybe after a difficult surgery later in life, there were certainly moments where he thought, I just want to die. And I started to realize that this is something that people nearing the end of life might say. But what I could not accept, and what I still cannot accept, is the society, the family members, the so-called friends of such a person conceding and capitulating to what is basically a form of suicidal ideation at a moment of particular vulnerability. The other big impression that was made on me by my relationship with my grandparents was that his wife, my grandmother, also moved to Calgary to be closer to us, but she had dementia, and so she was in assisted care. And he went every day to go and visit her. And I was a teenager at the time, and I saw him get dressed up in a really sharp suit and put on his cap and dress up for her and go and spend time with her, though I realized after a couple minutes that she would completely forget the visit. And what was I, as a teenager, with my own concerns, with my own anxieties, with my own preoccupations, to make of this? I don't think I even spent a lot of time dwelling on it at the time. But now, look at this. Twice a lifetime later for me, I still remember that. I still remember that love, that going to her, that her being worthwhile and worth visiting. And so these topics touch all of us. We've heard about the prevalence of euthanasia in Canada. Now 1 in 20 deaths in Canada is a euthanasia death. This means that this is touching all of us personally and practically. Usually when I speak, there's not a single time where a line doesn't form afterward with people coming up one after the other, sharing their personal stories of having just lost someone to euthanasia or having someone in their life who is thinking about it and struggling and contending with the questions of how do I stay in this person's life? How do I accompany them? How do I push back but not get pushed out? These questions are weighing on our hearts. And while we have been engaging with so many heavy issues today, the good news is these issues create an opening for the most meaningful conversations. The good news is euthanasia and other life issues are not principally medical or healthcare issues. They are fundamentally human and existential issues. And we know that by people's own admission. In the government survey, asking people who are thinking of euthanasia what kind of suffering is leading to that request, the #1 kind of suffering, by people's own admission, is a loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. There may be other underlying conditions, medical conditions to be sure, but when people speak about the kind of suffering leading to that request for euthanasia, it's the inability to do meaningful life activities. My life is not as it was before. Who am I now? Will anybody love me this way? In my disability, in my vulnerability. So these reasons, these insecurities about being a burden, about not being able to do the things that I'm used to, this is a cry of the heart. And this actually makes our task so beautiful and so meaningful. Not just a culture war, but something really to stake our own identity and lives on, because these questions are at the core of every human heart. This is why I like to say that euthanasia is quite literally the opposite of love. Here's why. Love says, it's good you exist. I want you to be here. You belong in the world. I do. I want you to be here. It's good you exist. And euthanasia says, I'm not sure it's so good you exist. Maybe you would be better off dead. Maybe we don't have room for you anymore. So euthanasia is literally the opposite of love. And if we want to counter it, then we've got to put more love into the world and get creative for responding to this cry of the heart. So why are people asking for euthanasia? Existential reasons, inability to engage in meaningful life activities, insecurities that anyone will love me this way. I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who told me that long before euthanasia had been legalized in Canada, her mother used to say, if I'm ever suffering or I lose my faculties, I would like assisted suicide. And my friend at the time was a teenager, and this really distressed her. Totally secular family. And finally, she had the courage to ask her mother, why do you keep talking like this? It's really upsetting me. And her mother said, well, if I'm ever in a great deal of pain, or I don't have my wits about me, I might say something really mean and hateful, and then no one would love me. And my friend was a teenager and quick-thinking one, and she said, Mom, you already say mean and hateful things, and I still love you. We have to be curious about that underlying insecurity, about that underlying, well, if I'm no longer useful, if I'm no longer affirmed, these are existential questions. This is the cry of the heart. And the drama of suffering can only be transformed. I love this saying, that the drama of suffering can only be transformed when it is transformed into a drama of love. And there is no good story without suffering. When you think, how can I have these conversations with people who maybe don't share my tradition or don't share my values? I would say, think of how you might be able to ask people, who do you admire? Tell me a story of a noble death. Tell me a story of someone you admire. Why? And I guarantee you the stories that people find exemplary and worth sharing are stories of resilience and heroism. We naturally tend to the admiration of these things. And so you can invite these conversations of depth and meaning. It is so important that we also deepen a kind of intergenerational solidarity within our culture too. I was speaking about that yesterday to a group here at the Basilica. Part of these crises are a crisis of fragmentation between generations. Just today, someone sent me a website of Alienated Grandparents Anonymous. And it's an entire website with online meetings for grandparents who are alienated or estranged from their grandchildren. And I was reading the testimonies of people on this website, and one person said, "This is killing us. And so this estrangement and alienation itself is a form of social euthanasia that perhaps precedes the literal euthanasia. Euthanasia is not principally driven by autonomy and empowerment, but by this alienation and estrangement. And if we're curious enough, then we will hear and recognize that this is the case by people's own admission. And why are people participating in it? Many Canadians are afraid they're going to lose the relationship, that they won't be able to accompany the person if they don't agree and support the person's decision. But I really want to encourage that mounting resistance to what is essentially a form of suicidal ideation is always an act of love. And a person who is talking about suicide or euthanasia is waiting for someone who will push back and who will mount that resistance. And so is waiting for you, and you become responsible in these moments to be that one. Mounting resistance to what is a form of suicidal ideation is always an act of love. And the good news there is that even if a person in their freedom chooses to go through with euthanasia, you will have loved them well and faithfully to the end. By letting the person know not principles, not abstractions, but that I love you too much to see you go through with this. That you would break my heart if you left me. Or as one friend put it, it would be a mercy for you not to go through with this and leave me wondering for the rest of my life what I did wrong. It would be a mercy for you not to make this choice. Yes, it's your choice. Yes, you have autonomy. But this choice also has the power to wound. And so it would be a mercy if you don't make this choice and leave me wondering with all this insecurity and doubt. More and more, I am hearing from adult grandchildren about the loss of their grandparents to euthanasia. I was recently speaking with one, a 28-year-old woman whose grandmother was euthanized in her 90s when her death was probably fairly imminent. And my friend explained, this woman was the matriarch of our entire family, the paragon of strength. No one messed with grandma. The strongest woman I ever knew. But then in a moment of weakness that she thought was strength, because what was her motivation? She didn't want to be remembered weak. Her whole identity was as the matriarch. It wasn't so much her physical suffering, it was she couldn't bear the shame of being remembered in her vulnerability. That was clear. And so my friend says, if the strongest woman I knew could choose this and in a moment give up, then what chance do I stand? I who struggle with my mental health, I who have all kinds of insecurities and doubts, what chance do I have? And so euthanasia really is a form of self-harm. And what can the older generation say to the younger generation, so often struggling with various forms of self-harm, if this is a kind of older generation's version of it? And the reasons given are often the same, both with euthanasia and various forms of self-harm, whether cutting or eating disorders. It's an attempt to put into control an out-of-control situation. I read so often the obituaries of people who have died by euthanasia, and so often that person has lost a spouse. And so it is like they have lost their own life, and their entire world is shattered. And I think about how Viktor Frankl, when he was counseling someone in a similar situation, a man who was completely distraught completely bereaved over the death of his wife. And Viktor Frankl said to him, well, imagine it had been the other way around, and your wife was grieving you. By surviving her, you spare her the suffering that you now live. And that was a transformation for him, because his suffering, his grief, was able to take on the form of a sacrifice. And that's what we all need, a horizon of transcendence, something that enables the illnesses, diseases, sorrows, losses that we undergo to have something of the character of sacrifice, where we realize that we belong to one another and how we die changes the entire meaning of our lives. I think of one woman who gave a beautiful account of it. She was dying of cancer and had a young family, and she said, my story is not going to be written by cancer, it's going to be written by love. And how a story ends changes the meaning of every page. How a story ends changes the meaning of every page. These are deep and existential questions. Another adult grandchild who I interviewed recently, and these videos will be coming out soon, so I hope you can join the email list and receive them. There are 8 videos, short films on dyingtomeetyou.com, and I'll pass around my card. But dyingtomeetyou.com, positive alternative vision for humanizing our culture at end of life. So this other one who I interviewed, 38-year-old man, both of his grandmothers were euthanized within 2 months of each other. His last 2 grandparents. And I ask him, I say, it's always painful to lose those we love. What difference does it make when someone dies by euthanasia? And in a way that is more succinct and articulate than I could ever dream, he said with perfect naturalness, it's the choice of maid that hurts. It's the choice of maid that hurts. Because as my friend had said earlier, I'm left with the question, what did I do wrong? Bless you. He says, did I not love you the correct way? Did I not make you feel like you're not a burden in my life? And he juxtaposes the death of his 2 grandmothers with the death of his grandfathers who died naturally. He says, there was nothing else I could do. And the peace that he experiences over the natural death versus the insecurity and doubt that plagues him over his grandmother's deaths. The good news is these things are palpable. They are so existential, they are so deeply experiential that the testimonies are profoundly convincing. And I mentioned, or it was mentioned in the reading of my bio, that I worked in politics for some time trying to address these issues. I had returned to Canada after having studied a couple years in Poland, and the issue of the day quickly became the legislative expansion of euthanasia on the basis of disability and mental illness, Bill C-7. Fewer than 5 years after legalization and before the legislated statutory review, the government was already removing the safeguards that had been deemed essential just some years prior. And one of my dear friends who has cerebral palsy, lives independently, works full-time, she and I are really good friends. We go for brunch every week. Even before this expansion had happened, she told me that she had gotten really sick one day, checked herself into the hospital, and was told, whatever you have, it's really affecting your breathing. And if it comes to it, you might need oxygen. Is that something you would want? And she said,
I'll be all right.
Of course. But then the doctor followed that up a moment later and said, are you sure? And my friend says, apparently I qualified for an end to my life right there. I know it must have looked bleak. I was a single woman, disabled, very sick and tired, but she had pneumonia. She got over it. We cannot have any criteria where people are qualifying for death that does not throw an entire demographic, and in fact all of us, into a state of precariousness. The criteria makes us all more precarious. We make ourselves precarious by people's dismissal. And people are less and less free because if 9 out of 10 people, this is not the statistic, but if 9 out of 10 people with ALS were to opt for euthanasia, how free is that one person with ALS not to do it? Aren't they regarded maybe as selfish or foolish? so it impinges upon the freedom of others. And we have heard from people, particularly those with disabilities, who say, euthanasia is the one thing the government is telling me that I qualify for. It's the first time I found out my eligibility for something this quickly. We have a lot of responsibility, but this work is so meaningful and the stories are so moving that for me, I can't resist finding it a deep source of joy, even amidst the challenges. And working on Parliament Hill during that Bill C7 debate, we put out a call for stories. I was at the time working in a member of Parliament's office, MP Garnet Jennis, and we put out a call for stories and said, we need your stories to fight Bill C7. We received hundreds upon hundreds of emails, and suddenly it seemed like this parliamentary office, in the midst of the pandemic, had become a suicide crisis line, had become a crisis center. And those stories have not left me. They continue to spur me on and to stay spurring my conscience to speak to you today. And those stories are all around us, in your own lives, in your own families, in these neighborhoods. And it's always going to be more demanding to save lives than to dismiss them. But it's so much more beautiful. Another thing that a quotation I just want to share with you, since we've been speaking a lot about dignity and compassion, I love this quotation of compassion, that compassion is a communion in suffering of those who love. A communion in suffering of those who love. Another thing you can encourage when engaging everyday people in these conversations is, when have you had the moment of greatest intimacy, depth, and encounter? And probably when you think about it, they are the moments bearing your woundedness, maybe moments of suffering, maybe accompanying someone in a time of grief or loss. These moments, far from hardening us about life, are exactly what make us tender, are exactly what cultivate the ethical sensitivity that humanizes our society against the dehumanization of which we've been speaking all day. And all of you are so committed to this. And there's a way in which we can do this no matter what our capabilities. No matter what our capacities, we can promote life even in how we suffer and die. Even when we can't speak, even when we can't remember, we can bear witness to the dignity and value of life simply, as we heard, simply to be is holy, and simply to live is a gift. So we can take great joy in how nothing of the vicissitudes of life can threaten the beauty of the lives that we live and the light that we put into the world by the very fact that we are. I'm very excited to say that there are many reasons for hope, even amidst a very challenging climate where many jurisdictions are expanding euthanasia.